Kevin Brennan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that the copyright, open brackets, rights and remuneration of musicians, etc., close brackets, bill be read a second time. Madam Deputy Speaker, I refer the House to my entry in the Register of Members' interests, including some small earnings as a musician, and my membership of the Musicians' Union and their financial support at election time. And I also declare my membership of the Ivors Academy, which represents the interests of songwriters and composers. I should add that having taken an interest in the subject of the music industry over the 20 years that I've been in this House, including completing a fellowship with the Industry and Parliament Trust on the music industry, I've probably crossed paths and attended events with almost every organisation who is interested in this bill and its proposals at one time or another. And I know that some in the industry like to hide the wiring with bright lights and promises, but as policymakers, we should want to get this right for our wonderful British creators, the bedrock of the music industry. And I want to make it clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, from the outset, my interest here is not to pursue a party political battle, but to work across the House and across the sector with anyone who really is interested in achieving better remuneration for musicians, songwriters and composers in this new and exciting era of music streaming. When I was first elected to this House, the music industry encountered an existential crisis. The new digital technology of file sharing meant that for the first time in history it was possible to copy and share recorded music instantly at zero cost, with no physical medium required. And it led some to question whether it would ever be possible for creators to earn money from their recorded music again. And over the years it brought a steep decline in revenue to the music industry. Some of us in Parliament, and I include my right honourable friend, the member for East Yorkshire, who's in his place on the other side of the House, and my honourable friend, the member for Perth and North Perthshire. We are occasionally together in a musical enterprise called MP4. But all of us, as a group, and including our former colleague Ian Causey, argued strongly at the time, and one of the reasons we put the group together, apart from having fun, was to argue strongly at the time that it was vital for the UK economy and for creators that we support the music industry in its efforts to protect and extend and enforce copyright, and to develop new technologies to allow for safe, legal and monetised consumption of music so that rights holders and creators could be paid. We supported the preservation, across party, we supported the preservation of intellectual property when some flirted with the anarchy of piracy. And eventually, Madam Deputy Speaker, that new technology came along, first with legal downloading and then with streaming on services like Spotify and Apple Music, which I know many right honourable members are very familiar with. So that, so much so that this is now the dominant way in which people consume music across the world, and particularly here in the UK. It makes up more than 70% of UK recorded music revenues, generating hundreds of millions of pounds of new revenue for the UK music industry. I will give way.
I thank him for giving way and congratulate him on his bill. Many people watching this debate may think this is purely about the household stars, and actually we are arguing here over people already wealthy. But I met yesterday a viola player who's actually appeared on 20,000 different records that are online, but actually doesn't receive a single penny for those contributions. So isn't his bill not just for the household stars, but for every single musician out there?
Well, my honourable friend's absolutely correct, and I will go on and develop in my remarks why it's correct what he said. But it's interesting, orchestra players actually often receive nothing when the music is streamed. In fact, the only person who receives any money sometimes is the only person who's not making any noise, namely the conductor of the orchestra. But that's yet another irony of this system that we're discussing today, Madam Deputy Speaker. So let's be clear anyway, streaming is an incredible technology. It enables us to have almost the entire catalogue of the world's music in our pockets. And to those of us who grew up in an analogue world, carrying around 12-inch vinyl copies of the latest David Bowie album under our arms. It's nothing short of miraculous that you can actually play music in this way. But artists and songwriters have not had the same boon as the major record companies themselves from this new windfall.
Will you give way?
I will give way, yes.
I'm most grateful, and I'll congratulate him on his bill. Would you agree it's a scandal that artists are getting perhaps a quarter of what the big record labels are getting from streaming services? And as one friend said, it's not only the stars, it's also people like music students who are looking for a career in music, as well as songwriters and performers. I want many in my constituency. The cost of living is extremely high. They're getting no money, and they've just had a terrible 2 years.
Well, my friend is absolutely correct, and I want to see, the possibility for those young people to be able to earn at least some part of their living from recorded music, and not entirely rely on live music. But I'll go on and develop that further in my remarks. I'll just make one further point, then I'll give way to the Honourable Member. It's actually, what I was saying was that artists and songwriters haven't had the same boon. It's actually a staggering fact, and I think members across the House would be staggered by this, that the chairman and CEO of one of the 3 major corporations that dominate this market of recorded music is set to receive more income this year, £153 million, according to industry press reports, than every songwriter and composer in the UK combined, including the rich ones, will receive from the streaming of their music in this country. I think facts like this and the desperate plight of musicians who, as my honourable friend was just saying, have been unable to perform live due to COVID, has really triggered this close scrutiny of exactly what is going on with the economics of music streaming. I'll give way to the Honourable Member.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Member, and again I congratulate him, and I'm happy to support his bill. I hope that it does get government support, if not necessarily today, then at some stage, because I think we should all see this as an important part of the levelling up agenda. The levelling up agenda will never achieve the things that we want it to achieve unless it addresses the imbalance of power between big corporates on the one hand and the individual and the small business on the other. And that's what is at the heart of the Honourable Member's bill, and it's why I think all those who purport to support levelling up should be supporting it today.
I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention, and he is right. Our duty as politicians is occasionally to utter rhetoric, but our duty as politicians is to turn it into reality. And in the case of the music industry, he's absolutely right. This is a levelling up measure. I will give way, yes.
I'm grateful, and I congratulate him on securing this bill. But does he share the concerns of some that whilst this bill might increase the income of some artists, there's a real danger that other artists within the sector might see their income fall, and that might affect investment?
Thank you for his intervention. I'm going to come on to that point, actually, because I know there's a series of points that have been made about the bill, and I'll come on to that later in my remarks, and I thank him for his intervention. So my bill today, Madam Deputy Speaker, largely endeavours to bring into law measures that were proposed in the DCMS Select Committee report of earlier this year. And I would like to pass on to the House the apologies of the Chair of the Select Committee, who's unable to come because he has a constituency emergency today. The report, which is titled The Economics of Music Streaming, was unanimously agreed, cross-party, after many, many months of hearings with witnesses from all parts of the music industry, after receiving hundreds of written submissions on the subject. And I think it's fair to say that my fellow members of the committee, including my honourable friend, the honourable member for Sunderland Central, who's sitting close by today, were staggered by some of the evidence. Perhaps those who hadn't been particularly attentive previously to music industry issues were staggered by some of the evidence they heard, and by the seeming unwillingness of those at the top of the music industry to acknowledge the problems we uncovered and to act to put them right and rebalance the music industry to support creators. I do welcome the fact, actually, that one of those 3 majors, Sony, did at least agree to pay unrecouped artists with year 2000 contracts some money when their music is streamed. But sadly, the other big 2, Warner and Universal, have not followed suit, and in the latter case have issued a public share offering which will result in that extraordinary £153 million payout to their boss at a time when many artists have been struggling to pay their rent, as we heard in evidence. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to outline for the House the main measures contained within my bill, which extends the existing Copyright Designs and Patents Act 1988 to modernise the law for the new world of music streaming. One of the features of streaming technology, which honourable members will be familiar with, I'm sure, is when you play a piece of music on a streaming service, it's not quite the same as the action of choosing to play a record, but neither is it quite the same as listening passively to music on the radio. How it is treated in law is crucial because it affects how much artists and songwriters get paid. When you stream music, sometimes you choose what you want to listen to, or an algorithm chooses for you based on the things it thinks that you might enjoy. And frequently you might start playing something of your choice, and the service will continue to play music to you that it chooses, which in some ways makes it more like a radio station. To emphasise the point, honourable members may be familiar, there's even a feature called Radio in Spotify on that platform. Now, during the course of our Select Committee inquiry, we learned that music listening is gradually moving from traditional broadcasting towards streaming. And it has been reported, and was in a speech by an executive themselves from Spotify, that their corporate aim is to replace radio gradually as the main way that people listen to music. Now, under existing UK copyright law, Madam Deputy Speaker, when music is played on the radio, artists are entitled to an unwaivable payment called equitable remuneration. It's an important part of the way that musicians can earn income from recorded music on top of any session fees and on top of the terms of any recording contract. If, as Spotify predicts, radio listening declines in favour of streaming, as is happening, then clearly musicians will lose income from equitable remuneration as that trend develops. But the record labels argue that streaming music is the equivalent of the sale of a record. The jargon term in law is making available. Therefore, they say that musicians should be paid on the basis of recording contracts, many of which were signed in relation to the production and distribution of physical records before the technology of streaming was even invented. Now, yes, I will give it, of course. Yeah.
The honourable gentleman, very much as he probably knows, I've worked in commercial radio for more than 20 years and spent much of my time negotiating with record labels as part of a working group. I do think that UK musicians are being devalued, and I don't think there are fair earnings. But I think ad-funded streaming services are not paying fairly for the music that drives their services. And that actually is the issue that we really should tackle here.
I do thank the Honourable Member for his intervention as a well-informed one. And he is right, there is an issue with ad-funded streaming services and the rates that they pay. The committee concluded that the fix, if you like, that I'm proposing today was the best way to build on existing UK law to try to rectify this matter. But of course the issue of how much streaming services pay and how much they are paid by record companies, they take about 30% of the cut of the subscription, after the Chancellor has his bit, of the subscription that's paid by us, and of course of the ad revenues, of course. But it's a valid point. But the committee concluded this was the best way forward, and we did so unanimously across party. Now, my bill, as I say, as recommended by the Select Committee, provides performers on a recording with a right to an unwaivable payment or equitable remuneration when their music is streamed. And that's akin to the existing right in radio and broadcast. And importantly, it doesn't take away the right of labels to value their exclusive rights. Those rights remain intact. And my bill doesn't dictate either, Madam Deputy Speaker, what the value of any remuneration should be. That's best settled, as now, by agreement between the parties. But it does make clear that this is, in a moment, it does make clear that this is an additional payment and could be referred to the existing copyright tribunal where there's a difference of opinion. I'll give way at that point to the Honourable Lady.
Thank you for giving way and for this very important discussion and debate this morning. I wondered in what way these proposals would help the situation that Dame Vera Lynn found herself in, one of our most loved entertainers and icons across the country, and yet she found herself with a revival of some of her most famous and beloved songs and not receiving royalties from a contract that was conceived and signed before the internet had even been considered and built. I'd be grateful if we could explore that.
Well, I think the Honourable Lady makes a very powerful and pertinent point, and she's absolutely right. Wonderful British artists like Dame Vera Lynn, who recorded music in an era when, let's face it, some record contracts were not exactly favourable towards the artists, are still held to the terms of those contracts by record labels very often, sometimes in a state that's called being unrecouped, namely the record label decides actually they don't owe them anything at all because of the original advance they made for the record. But the point is this: they no longer have to manufacture records, they no longer have to distribute that records, a percentage of them don't get broken on the way to the record shop. All those costs are gone, and they've still got, you know, Dame Vera Lynn's recordings, and they put them out there and they make money from them, but under the terms of that legacy contract they don't have to pay a penny. I'll come on to explain how my bill actually would take care of the very issue that the Honourable Lady quite rightly raises. The second major provision of the bill, Madam Deputy Speaker, so the first part was equitable remuneration. It would place an obligation for transparency on those who have had rights transferred or licensed to them to provide timely and comprehensive information to the songwriter, composer or artist about where and how their music is being played, so that they can be sure that they're being paid what they're due. Now, the committee recommended this after hearing evidence that it's often very difficult for artists and songwriters to gain any clarity or audit their works. We heard of money they should be paid disappearing into what in the industry are known as so-called black boxes. And indeed, it's clear songwriters particularly suffer because of poor data standards. On the subject of the value of streaming to songwriters, the committee expressed concern about how the big three record labels, who I mentioned earlier, which wield huge market power, own large parts of the music publishing business too, and how that might influence the way in which revenue from streaming is distributed. To clarify, Madam Deputy Speaker, if the big three make more profit from their rights in the recording than they do in the publishing, there's a disincentive for them to pay songwriters a competitive share of streaming revenue. The publishing right ought to be competing for more value against the recording, but it appears to be stifled by this problem of ownership. And at that point, I want to praise the government, actually, for taking note of these concerns in our Select Committee report about the impact of monopoly power and cross-ownership in the music industry, and referring the matter to the Competition and Markets Authority for a study into potential market failure. And the government deserves due credit for doing that. And I'd like to say to the Minister that whatever the outcome of today's debate, reform is needed on this subject, and I hope that he and the government will continue to lean into this issue and press the big three record labels, you know, to come to the table, to acknowledge the issue and to offer up solutions rather than remaining, as they occasionally seem to be, in denial. And I hope he might say something about that when he responds later on to the debate. The third major provision of the bill, Madam Deputy Speaker, would allow for contract adjustment when someone, often at the beginning of their career, and we all know constituents like this, desperate for a chance to have their music heard, enters into an agreement which eventually results in payment to them, which is disproportionately low compared to subsequent revenues derived from the exploitation of their music. Now, this right would strengthen the position of the weaker party entering into such an agreement, and it would encourage rights holders to make sure that agreements were fair and equitable in the first place, as ultimately the songwriter or performer would be able to appeal to the Copyright Tribunal to adjudicate on that contract. And the fourth and final provision of the bill, Madam Deputy Speaker, would give UK songwriters and artists a right that is available in other jurisdictions, including in the USA, but not in the UK, if after a period of 20 years they are dissatisfied with the efforts being made by record labels or publishers, and this would apply to Dame Vera Lynn, I'm glad to say, were she still with us. If they're dissatisfied with the efforts being made by record labels or publishers, musicians could give notice of their intention to reclaim their rights to exploit their music or transfer that right to another label or publisher who might do a better job than the existing one. The importance of this proposal, Madam Deputy Speaker, was highlighted very recently, actually, in the case of the UK recording artist 4TET. Dissatisfied with the amount of money he was getting via his record label from streaming, he engaged lawyers to challenge his contract. The response of his label to that has been to remove his music altogether from streaming services, effectively a restraint of trade for that artist. His recording contract predated streaming. Under the provisions of my bill, he could give notice that he intended to reclaim his music. And this would incentivise labels to do better deals with artists. And in fairness, many independent labels actually do have better deals with artists these days, often taking rights for 15 years rather than the lifetime of copyright, as has been the tradition. Now, I just want to go on to anticipate perhaps some of the concerns that honourable members may have, and I welcome their interest in today's debate. But if they've been following the debate outside the House, there are some issues that have been raised. One of the issues is that put forward is that the UK music industry creates a lot of jobs, creates a lot of growth and exports. It's an important part of the UK's soft power abroad. Why rush to introduce legislation that could affect that world-leading status? Well, in response, I'd remind honourable members that 1 in 10 streams originate in the UK, but only around 1/20 of streaming income comes back to the UK. Far from undermining our position, my bill seeks to bring much of that lost income back into the hands of working British professionals. This is an evidence-based reform. And I know that some in the music industry say we need more evidence. I'm all for evidence. But it would have been helpful if the record labels and the BPI, even after 2 requests from the previous Secretary of State for Culture, had supplied the evidence that the Intellectual Property Office wanted and were asking for to volunteer some data on their royalty distributions. Why, even after the Secretary of State twice to our committee said they should do that, did they not provide that evidence? If they're going to say we need evidence-based reform, they need to supply the evidence. Now, honourable members may have seen a recent piece from the former Chief Executive of EMI Music UK suggesting that measures in the bill, though well-intentioned, could undermine the recovery of the UK's music sector following the impact of the pandemic. Well, I'm afraid there's a slight fallacy here, Madam Deputy Speaker, because in fact there has been no overall effect from the pandemic on the recording music industry. Streaming revenue actually grew by 20% in 2020. The sad fact is that EMI is no longer a British-owned company, much to my regret and to many people. And inexplicably, the Chief Executive Officer appears to be conflating the recording business with live business, which has been decimated by COVID and emphasises even more why musicians need to get paid for their recorded music. Some members will have seen concern expressed about independent record labels who may invest the most in new emerging musical talent. And is it the case that my bill would reduce the amount of funding that smaller labels have available for supporting fledgling artists? Well, I should point out that the CEO of the Association of Independent Music made a speech 5 years ago to the European Union calling for exactly what I'm proposing today to be implemented right across Europe at a time when that person was representing artists. So it is interesting to say that someone says that there's not enough evidence, and 5 years ago they were calling for the very measure which I'm calling upon today. Plenty of evidence has accumulated in the meantime. But it's important to say that equitable remuneration can be applied in such a way to take account of smaller independent labels who already have ethical business practices. And of course, in practice, it can and should operate in that way by agreement, as I said earlier. Now, colleagues will also have been told that there's not a general consensus in the music industry on what the impact of introducing equitable remuneration for streaming would be. And the argument goes that, therefore, the government's right to undertake an extensive programme of research with all parts of the industry. And actually, I want to make it clear, I welcome the fact that the government has committed to undertake this work. But I do call upon the record labels to fully collaborate and cooperate and provide the information required for the government to be able to get a grip on the details of the issue. But it doesn't preclude, in my view, allowing this bill through its second reading and into committee and all the other parliamentary stages that will take a long period of time in any case, where that research can inform its amendment and passage. And the government ultimately does have control of the timetable. Now, some have suggested that reintroducing equitable remuneration might have the unintended consequence of seeing some independent artists receive less money from streaming because session musicians would be entitled to be paid. In fact, fully independent music accounts for a very small percent, probably about 6% of the total market, and fully independent artists who experience success are actually the ones making the most from streaming of any of their peers. It may actually be the case that the administration of ER would be cheaper to these artists than the distribution deals they have to do currently as independent artists. In any case, it's likely that any impact could be marginal, and it would entirely be possible to adapt the proposal to meet any concerns that arise. And another concern mentioned is that equitable remuneration could see record companies offer worse contracts, reduce advance payments to new talent, or disinvest in the UK in order to make up for a loss of revenue from streaming. Now, as advance payments, as the committee heard, to artists are ultimately what keep them in debt for a long period of time, perhaps a cooling effect on that and the size of those advances wouldn't be a bad thing. But as for companies, Madam Deputy Speaker, who are sometimes making 20% profit margins in the streaming era with none of the costs associated with distribution or manufacturing, saying that they will pass on any cut to that margin onto the artists, onto their own artists, is surely the strongest possible evidence that there's something very wrong with competition in this market. And anyone who believes in competition in this market, I think, should note that approach. It's also been said that multinational record labels might decrease their investment in the UK if the streaming market in the UK became less competitive. Actually, these changes will make the UK market much, much more competitive. The music industry is characterised best currently as an oligopoly. That's clear to all. Indeed, one company may control as much as 40% of the market. Giving artists more control over their rights and letting those rights change hands more freely will hugely open up the market to smaller independent labels and artists. And when changes were made in 2003 to copyright around film, similar points were made, but we have seen the burgeoning expansion of the British film industry since that point. And I want the same for music. I'll give way to the Honourable and Gallant Member.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Honourable Gentleman for allowing me to intervene. When the Honourable Gentleman talks of equitable remuneration, and he mentions Dame Vera Lynn and the sad fact that she's no longer with us, does equitable remuneration still apply to the heirs of her estate, her music estate?
Yes, it is the case that the ownership of copyright, as with publishing a book and so on, does extend in the case of composers and songwriters beyond the 75 years beyond death. So it does apply to their estate. And in the case of recording artists, it applies for 70 years after the date of the recording. It was extended for 20 years, actually, in an initiative that my honourable friend, the member for North Perthshire, and my right honourable friend, the member for East Yorkshire, supported in the mid-2000s, and that's the reason why it is 70 years rather than 50 years. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm immensely proud of the contribution that British musicians and songwriters have made to the culture and economy of the UK. Anyone who's watched the recent clip of the Beatles documentary, where out of the void, Paul McCartney conjures into being the classic song Get Back, after only a couple of minutes, could only be stunned by the sheer genius and sweet mystery of musical creation. That tradition of great British artists, musicians and songwriters continues to this day. But it's threatened if we don't adapt our legal structures to ensure that artists and composers, songwriters are properly paid when their music is played, in whatever format develops. Some with vested interests to protect would almost have us believe that this well-researched proposal, based on a groundbreaking Parliamentary Select Committee report, agreed unanimously, cross-party, would lead to some sort of anarchy in the UK music industry. I'm afraid, man, see, there's an element of hyperbole and panic, I think, in their response. Much as I love that seminal British punk record of Rebellion, this bill is not about anarchy in the UK. This bill is about equity in the UK music industry. And I ask the House to support its second reading so that we can get on and scrutinise it in the detail such a serious proposal deserves.
Question is that the bill be now read a second time. John Whittingdale.